Hello, my name is Eddie Jennings from the website ejsllc.com, and this is the first of two videos about the basics of music intervals. I plan to do a series on some basic concepts and then do another series a bit later on some more advanced interval concepts. But in this quick little two-video series, I'm going to go over the idea of a whole step and a half step. Those are the basic building blocks of all musical intervals. And in the second video, I'm going to take that and expand into spelling major scales and start talking about something called diatonic intervals. This is real basic. If you know nothing about music intervals, this is a great place to start your learning. And without further ado, let's get started. Before I begin, I have to give a little shout out to a couple of band director friends of mine, Roland Ventura and Eric Young. They're the ones that turned me on to the idea that I'm going to talk to you about with learning the whole steps and half steps. And it's something that was effective for their students. I found it to be effective for my students, and hopefully it'll be effective for you as you're learning about our intervals with this series. So what we have here is a ruler. And on this ruler, I have labeled various points with letters and some sharp and flat symbols. And I'll go over those. And we're going to use this to visualize the distance for intervals and also to associate letters and how this works. A little bit later in the video, I'm going to show you how this looks on a keyboard as far as identifying whole steps and half steps. So the first thing to understand is the distance between two, I'm going to change the color here to green, the distance between 2 points on this ruler is a half step. As you know, just from knowing the word interval, an interval is the measure of a distance. And so any single point on this ruler is a half step. So if I were to start here at D and move to D sharp, E flat, and I'll talk in a minute about why you have two labels for those notes, you have a half step. If I were to go from G to G sharp, that's going to be a half step. So if you do the math here, if one of these tick marks equals a half step, I'm going to change the color to red, then if you were to move two tick marks, such as this E to the F sharp, G flat here, that would be a whole step. And then likewise, if I move from, say, C, B sharp to D, that's also a whole step. So it's pretty easy to see. It's kind of like on a ruler where you have some marks are a whole inch and some marks are a half inch. Or if you're looking at centimeters and you have 5 millimeters is half of 1 centimeter. It's the same idea here, whole steps and half steps. It's really no more complicated than that. Now if you notice, I have the two arrows here. I'm playing around with my colors here. I'm going to change the color to orange. Let me circle this arrow right here and then one on the other end. This represents the fact that this can keep going. So if I were to draw another tick mark, again I'll keep this in orange, if I were to draw another tick mark on the very edge right here, this would be a sharp, let me change the font here, make it a little bit more readable, so we'll have our tick mark, this would be A sharp, B flat. And likewise, on the other end, if I were to add a tick mark here, this would be A. So the line keeps going. The same idea of the whole steps and half steps doesn't stop. This continues on. Now, the slash marks that you see, let me clean this up just a little bit here. The slash marks that I have underneath some notes, just like we have in our spoken language, we have some words that sound the same but are spelled differently. We have the same thing here in music. And the term for this is called enharmonic. notes. These are notes that sound the same but are spelled differently. And it'll make a little bit more sense if you go to a keyboard to see it, and you'll see that a little bit later. But this A sharp and B flat refers to the same note. A sharp raises a note by a half step. A flat lowers a note by a half step. So if I were to draw a little mini keyboard here, and this will be interesting. I'm not a graphic artist by any stretch of the imagination. So we have 3 sets of black keys here. We use red for this. So on a keyboard, if you have a set of 3 black keys in a row, this is where the letters would fall. So the half step, the sharp, raises a note a half step. So if we're on A and we make this A sharp, that would move us from the white key to the black key. A flat lowers a note by a half step. So if I were to be on B flat or B and move down a half step to the black key, that would be a B flat. Thus A sharp and B flat you're going to utilize the same key on the keyboard to play both notes. Thus they're enharmonic to one another. And you'll notice that almost every letter has an enharmonic spelling. There are 3 exceptions to that. You have D, G, and A. And if you're a little bit more advanced in your music theory and you've learned about double flats and double sharps, you'll know that there are some enharmonic spellings for D, G, and A using double flats and double sharps. But that's outside the scope of our basics here. There is one thing that I do want to point out, and that's something that I call a natural half step. Now, I haven't coined the phrase. I'm sure there are other theorists that have said this before. But this idea of the natural half step. And what I mean by this, it'll make more sense when you see it on the keyboard in a couple of minutes. If you were to follow along on the note ruler here, we have A sharp B. We know that that's a half step, right? Then we have, and if I'm just reading the top of the letters for our enharmonic notes, B to C is a half step. Oh, that's a terrible looking half. Let me try that again. B to C is a half step. Then we have C to C sharp to D. Notice how we're going from a note that is not sharp or flat to a note that is sharp or flat. C to C sharp to D, D to D sharp. And remember, each one of these little ticks on the ruler is a half step, D sharp to E. Then we get E to F. Now notice I'm just reading the top line of letters here, E to F. Notice there's no sharp in between. Then F, F sharp, G, G, G sharp, A, and then the line starts again. But if you notice, between B and C and between E and F, if you're reading the very top notes, there is no sharp in between that. We call those natural half steps. On the keyboard, you're going to see how there's no black key in between those notes on the keyboard, so visually it'll make a little bit more sense. But just have that in the back of your mind. The distance from a B to a C and from E to a F is a half step, even though we're staying on the natural notes. Now, a question that has probably already come up in your mind is, why have I listed all of the enharmonic spellings, such as E and F flat and F and E sharp? That'll make more sense in the future videos when I talk about spelling major scales and such. But for right now, just accept that I have provided you the enharmonic spellings for each of the notes. And notice how when I was speaking about counting up the half steps, I would usually say C to C sharp instead of C to D flat. That'll also make a little bit more sense when we get to spelling our major scales. Typically when we're spelling ascending or to the right, we're going to spell with sharps because we are raising notes the half step. Remember that sharp symbol. means to raise a half step. And if we're talking about lowering pitches or moving to the left on a keyboard or the note ruler, we're talking in flats, which lower notes by a half step. Sounding wise, if you press the key for A sharp, which is also the key for B flat, it's going to sound the same, but it's a spelling thing. It's kind of like you can make the sound cat by spelling K-A-T, but the correct spelling of cat is C-A-T. Well, generally when we are raising pitches, and I say generally because there's always exceptions to the rule, but generally when we're raising pitches, we're going to spell with sharps, and if we are lowering pitches, we're going to spell with flats. So next I'm going to show you basically this same thing, but on an actual keyboard, so you can see where these half steps and whole steps, and in some case, step and a half. For example, a little tangent here, but if I were to move from C all the way to D sharp, E flat, that would be 3 half steps, half step 1, half step 2, half step 3, for a total of 1 1/2 steps. So in just a moment, we'll go over to the keyboard and reinforce what we've seen here on the written note ruler. One of the easiest ways to understand about basic intervals such as whole steps and half steps is being able to see the distance. And here I have my electronic keyboard, and if you have access to a keyboard, being able to visualize the intervals will be a bit easier. That's not to say that you cannot learn intervals on other instruments, but I want to show you on the keyboard what some of these intervals look like. And again, with today's video, we are working on whole steps and half steps. So what we have here on a keyboard, any key that is directly adjacent to another, that distance is a half step. For example, if I start on this key here, which happens to be a C, and I move not to this key, but the very next directly adjacent key, that distance is a half step. So C to a C sharp, as we'll call this, is a half step. And then likewise, if I start on this black key and shift to the very next adjacent key, which is not this one, but rather the white key in the middle, that's also a half step. Now, as you can see, if you look at the pattern of the white keys and the black keys, there are 2 instances where there are 2 white keys that are directly touching one another. We have here, that's a half step, and here, that's also a half step. With these 2 exceptions, your half steps are going to be from white key to black key or black key to white key. Now, a whole step, as the name implies, if this distance is a half, then the other part of the distance here makes the whole step. So the distance between 2 of the white keys, if there's a black key in the middle, is a whole step. Likewise, if we have our 2 black keys, from here to here is a half step, from here to here is a whole step. So the distance between 2 black keys, if there is a single white key in the middle, is a whole step. Now, just a second ago, I talked about these 2 special combinations, these 2 white keys that are directly adjacent to one another. These would not be whole steps. There's no key in between these 2 white keys. These are half steps. Thus, the distance between these 2 black keys here would be what? It would be a step and a half, because the whole step comes from 2 half steps put together, is your first half step, is your second half step, so is your whole step. Then would be another half step. So from here to here is going to be a step and a half, or 3 half steps, depending on how you want to describe that. The same phenomenon happens here. Half step, half step, half step, so 3 halves equals 1 1/2, would be 1 1/2 steps. Now the same idea happens if you're descending or going toward the left on the keyboard. That's still a half step. That's still a half step. So whole steps and half steps, when you have a chance to see them either on paper with the note ruler or actually on a keyboard, really it's not that difficult of a concept to understand. Intervals are distances between notes, and then you can literally see the physical distance between some of the keys on the keyboard for whole steps and half steps. Also, we learned about what enharmonic notes are, which are going to be notes that sound the same but are spelled a bit differently. So in the next video, we're going to build on this and start building major scales and talking about diatonic intervals. Thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope you found it useful. If you did, make sure you click like and also subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you the next time.